When the item master is not managed correctly, you can get into outdated products being in there that are pushed to the preference card. You can get wrong pricing. They did it by the case rather than by the each. That pushes out to the patient's bill. Those are just some things that you start finding in this space.
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now it's time to roll back and start the first case.
On this episode of First Case, we speak with Paul Rhodes, perioperative consultant of clinical and business operations at auditmed.net. And we are really going to have a unique conversation today, Melanie. We've had prior interviews with people to talk about how supply chain is connected into the OR, and we've talked about it from the supply chain perspective, and we've talked about it from the vendor's perspective, but we've never really talked about it from within the OR. We're kind of like talking to that audience. Well, today we're pulling somebody from the OR business manager role, pulling them onto the show, and now we're going to be reflecting on those prior conversations, and we're going to expand on the conversation too. If you haven't heard the term revenue cycle or revenue capture before, you certainly better brace yourself. It's going to be all about the business of the operating room today.
I think that's just something that those of us that are in the OR day in and day out, we don't think about the business side of it. We just want it to be there, and we need it to work, and we need our charting to work. We need our charges and our implants to show up in the computer when we want to chart them. But there is somebody behind the scenes making all of that happen. And so, yeah, those words like expenses and operation or utilization or revenue capture, all of these things actually come into play, even though we might not see them every day. So hearing about what he does and how he makes what we do more efficient is a really good conversation for us to have.
Yeah. And the why we do it, I think, is some of the insights that you're going to get from today's episode. We're going to be right back after a short break with Paul Rhodes, perioperative consultant of clinical and business operations at auditmed.net.
Hi, I'm Paul Wafer.
I'm Melanie Perry.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A 17 Studios production, you're listening to First Case.
Today we are speaking with Paul Rhodes, perioperative consultant of clinical and business operations at auditmed.net. And Paul, we're really excited to have you on because we're going to be breaking down the role of the OR business manager and taking them from sort of the back end behind the scenes, making everything work and bringing them front and center for the conversation. Thanks so much for joining us today.
You bet. Thank you. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about this. I think as we talk about the operating room business manager or director, there's a lot of surgical business functions that are integrated into this space. Having had a clinical background myself, being on a trauma team, actually had my own auditing practice for 14 years in Georgia, and it expanded and brought me to the phase of where I am today. So I can not only do the talk from a business perspective, I also can do the clinical stuff. In fact, I just had to interact with a heart surgeon today on some mitral valves. So as we get into this, there are really functions that you really pay attention to in this space. And I'm going to kind of break them down into 4 areas. Really, it talks about expenses, it talks about operations, it talks about utilization, and we talk about revenue. When you start putting those pieces together, they all have what I call the domino effect on each other. An example would be in expenses. The item master. It's one of the foundations that you need in order to build your business model on. because this ultimately can affect your budget. It can affect preference cards as two examples. But then when you get into the operations piece, that really has an impact then on staffing models. How big is your business going to be? What are the staffing ratios to make sure that you're within budget? And you work with finance on that to make sure that things are I call it gelling right, or having the functional integration that you need. And then finally, when we talk about utilization, I'm talking here about operational analytics. That is, how can you take business operations, embed it into clinical activities, and see what the outcome is, and see whether or not it's worth the bang for the buck, or the, what do they call, the squeeze, to make sure that you're maximizing your efficiencies. We really get into that space too by doing ROIs. But then we also look at quality metrics too, to making sure the patients are safe in the operating room, and we work with the quality people too. So you can see we're kind of behind the scenes, not directly in front of the patient 24/7, but we do impact the staff that supports the patient.
Paul, maybe you can go into some of the types of information that you look at when you're doing your analysis and decision making in the OR. Why don't we start with your operational analytics? What are you looking at to see whether or not the department is doing a good job?
There are a number of ways to look at it. And we look at case volumes. We look at durations of cases, the length of them. We look at the actually the staffing model, and are we staffing to the case volume? Are we staffing to the block scheduling? When we talk about operational analytics, we're actually talking about a number of things. One of them is vendor contracts. And vendor contracts plays a big role in how much we pay for products. An example would be Stryker. If you're in the implant business and we do total hips, total knees, total joints, you really want to negotiate a contract that not only defines the pricing structure, but then how much product needs to be used. And you have to see, what are the doctors using? So now you're using business reports to bump it up against contractual stuff. Then based upon the volume, you could actually maybe negotiate a better price for the products that you're actually purchasing from them. So that's kind of a real quick insight to operational analytics.
So Paul, as a circulator, somebody who is working in the OR day in and day out, circulator, scrub techs, we don't see the business manager side of it ever. We just, work in the OR and we do what we do every day. So how does those two jobs, I guess, marry to make the OR efficient and to make us run well, the behind the scenes, what you do versus
Sure.
what we're doing on the front line?
Sure. One of the jobs I would say as the business director, the surgical business director, is to make sure that the staff has what they need. That's always been my motto. If you're in this space, you got to make sure. Now, how does that happen? Well, we can go back to the expense module that I'm talking about, and embedded in that is called the item master. My goal as a business director is to making sure that those products are embedded in the item master that we did with our contracts that I just spoke about. When those are embedded in the item master, that information then can be pushed over to what we call the electronic medical record. They, in turn, this is where it's got to work right. The nurse or the person that's putting together what we call preference cards or the recipe card for the case, based upon the doctor's preferences, starts pulling those products out of the item master. If it's not there, guess what? I just caused them a problem. They may pick the wrong product. The wrong product may come to the operating room. It could delay surgery.
Absolutely. I have lived that frustration. So I do feel that from the circulator standpoint, not having the right information so that the wrong thing gets pulled, or having the information not even in the electronic health record, like our charting. So then you go to put these implants in, or you go to document them and they don't even come up because they haven't been entered, and you're free charting. It takes forever. So yeah. So if that's where the OR business manager is coming in to make my life easier, I'm all about it, because anything that makes charting easier and faster is something I want.
There's another part of this too, Paul, that kind of fits into this is the descriptions in the item file and how that shows up on your preference list. You may be calling it something else than what Melanie is used to hearing it, right?
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you on that, Paul. In fact, what really happens in that space sometimes, then we got the circulating nurse or even the scrub tech guessing. But that even leads to other problems, because if the case is scheduled correctly, then we're hoping that the right preference card comes to the table. And that preference card, again, is based upon the item master. And if we don't have the procedures identified correctly, they could be pulling completely the wrong supplies for that case. And an example of that would be a laparoscopic case or a robotic case versus a laparotomy. If they misinterpreted the medical technology, they could actually pull the wrong supplies for everything. That would cause delays. That causes heartburn for the surgeons too. Trust me.
Yeah, it does.
I really like the connection to supply chain and how that helps make sure everything's streamlined. Like, for so long, the silos have really existed in healthcare, and we haven't talked about this from the OR business manager's perspective, but we have talked about it we've had somebody from supply chain on in the past who talked about this from a supply chain perspective. We've also had somebody come on who had experience as a vendor and, working in the OR with loaner trays and consignment, orthopedic,
sure,
trauma.
Yep.
So we've had
Been
that
there.
conversation from those angles, but not from within the OR and the business manager's role to really kind of tie that all together. So I thought I'd throw that out because, that's the recipe, right? P cards are the recipe. They can be a constant challenge, and it can really make supply chain's job very, very difficult when they're not on the same page with the clinicians on the front lines.
Oh, I couldn't agree more with you, especially when you get into this, because think about it. If you don't get the right pricing structure put in there based upon the contractual agreement you entered into with the vendor, all of a sudden your budgets are off. Hold it. Why are we paying more than this? Or why should we be doing that? Tomorrow, in fact, I have a capital equipment meeting that I have got to talk about capital equipment, some of the newest technologies that's being used in surgery. I had to do my homework before I show up at that meeting. Not only that, I got to work with the specialty coordinators across each phase, whether it be robotics, orthopedics, neurosurgery, eyes, urology. You've got to learn to do the talk and do the walk with them. And if you don't have a clinical background, some people struggle in that space. It's all about the numbers. When you're in the space and you can bridge those two gaps, really you're a resource that is invaluable not only to the team, but to the departments that support you. You got to realize in our space as a director like that, you can't live in a silo. If you silo yourself, you're missing out on way too many things. Because this not only bleeds into what you were talking about, Justin, as it pertains to the item master, but it also bleeds over into what we call payer contracts. And we get into the last component of this, the revenue cycle. Payer contracts, reimbursement is made according to contractual agreements the hospital enters into them for services that are rendered. And this all bleeds back all the way back to the expenses. You got to make sure that your contracts are right over on your vendor contracts. So when you do your negotiating for your payer agreements with United, Cigna, that those prices reflect something that's going to cause some kind of margin for you that gives you a positive, not a negative. So there's a lot of dancing in that space.
So what's interesting about the revenue cycle is even supply chain and rev cycle are already not always very well integrated. I have another podcast that's focused on supply chain, and I think it was our fourth guest, talked about how does supply chain engage revenue cycle. But this is the conversation we're having right now is a real end-to-end conversation that has everything to do with the fiscal wellness of a healthcare organization. And so, you're stringing it together really well, I think, because I think revenue cycle gets lost in the shuffle and contract compliance and everything else, like supply chain, kind of brings it in the door and makes sure it keeps humming, but they're not always looking at contract compliance. Do you agree that the OR actually has more visibility if they have the awareness about contract compliance because they're actually using the products? Do they have actually more visibility to that compliance?
Yes, but there's another piece that you have to speak to in this space. It's called the charge master. The charge master is where we take all the items that are in the item master and it goes across a markup table. That markup table then puts it in the charge master. The charge master is the billing dollar amount that's pushed out to the patient's bill. So we post charges in the operating room. The insurance company bills the insurance company. Now here's the catch. When you're doing payer contracts, you got to make sure you understand revenue codes, HCPCS codes, because those impact how you're going to be paid, because your payer contracts really are reflected in those spaces. Here's an example. If you're going to surgery and you're in the operating room for something as simple as a hernia repair with mesh, you really have got to understand that there is a per diem day for 4 days. And you put together 4 days and they're each $1,000 for the easy math. That would be $4,000 the hospital would be paid for that hospital stay. However, if they have a carve out or a special stipulation in the payer contract that says, hey, guess what? If you put in mesh and it hits these codes on the billing form you send to us, we're going to pay you 90% of what the invoice price was. So that then is an add-on. So you not only get paid now for the mesh, but you also get paid for the 4 days you were in the hospital. And all of this, and that's a very simplistic rendition of it, because you get into more complicated stuff when you start talking about orthopedics, when you start talking about chemotherapy, when you start talking about transplants, different animal altogether. However, it's very important that you support them from a clinical perspective in the payer contract department. And that's what I did for the largest healthcare systems in the state of Georgia for almost 14 years. And there were some ha-ha moments for them, because all they're doing is looking at the numbers. They really don't understand, how does all this tie together?
So, Paul, I see how this can impact the day-to-day operations and how it impacts the circulators and the techs in the rooms. How does your role impact the nursing director of the OR? How do you support the leadership within the department?
Well, there are a number of ways. One is I'm doing the capital review. So I am supporting them. They want me to do what I call the heavy lifting. They're the ones that want me to go around and talk to the people where the rubber meets the road, what we call specialty coordinators for these services. That's one element of it. When you stop and look at it, they also want me to look at staffing models. They want to make sure, are we within budget? How's the budget looking? Why are we out of budget? I always have to answer the questions, the variances to that. So that's another piece we look at. So when you start talking about these kind of things, you support them there. But really an important piece is called data analytics. And I'm sure you've heard that buzzword before. But the data analytics dive a little bit deeper into this because I touch on all phases of it. I'm talking about payer contracts. Who's our bigger payer source? What is the financial class they're with? What are the top 10? Or you might get into where's the largest volume? Which surgeon does the largest volume of cases? But volume of cases does not dictate time in the operating room. So I do a duration study also to see. I just had an example today. I had the top 3 surgeons in the operating room by volume. You look at the top 3 surgeons by volume, they were all mixed up. It was orthopedics. The orthopedic doctor had the highest volume in the operating room, but guess who had the most time? The heart surgeon. So it changes. Even though he had fewer cases, his volume was longer. These are things they want to know because when you start talking to the people in finance, which she relies you on to do too for you, you push this information over to them so you can make some pretty, what I call accurate assessments. Are we doing contract management? Oh, okay, we are. How many contracted nurses do we have in the operating room? How many traveler nurses? International. We have to put that together so it blends real well into the budget under what we call sub-accounts. So that's another space that we work in. I work with the doctors to make sure that we're getting equipment in, capital equipment. I work with vendors. They got other things. You separate the clinical and the business aspects of it, but when I get into a clinical situation, I automatically dive over and I talk to the clinical director so we can pull the pieces together.
Analytics-wise, are you looking at productivity as well? Do you have targets that you're supposed to meet in all the different areas? And it's not just the OR, right? Do you do all the perioperative areas?
No, I gear primarily towards the outpatient and inpatient department. We have 27 operating rooms, and that's the space that I work in. I do support endoscopy. but not to the point of where I get involved. I will give them statistical data and data that they can use. I also, in fact, we just developed, 3 months ago, we just put together a complete guidelines and scheduling protocol for them because they were without. And we're trying to get them, how do they schedule into a block? There's quite a few things that you got to go into, but unless you don't understand block scheduling and everything, that's another element that people get confused on. And they start scratching their head. So I know I've been all over the board with quite a few pieces, but when you touch on any of these, they impact something else.
Yeah, that was that real waterfall effect that you were talking about. And so one of the ways that they interact with each other is because it's built around a lot of data. You talked about taking the item master and then it essentially running through a tool that turns it into the charge master. Well, how do you keep the data clean? What are some of the challenges with making sure that that data stays good, doesn't get dirty, and then create a lot of problems for everybody, and again, end to end, right? Because once it gets in there and it's bad, we brought up rev cycle. A lot of people don't even think about that. By the time it starts working its way back there, that's where a lot of that revenue loss. And I know you use the term revenue capture. Well, the opposite happens with bad data.
And I tend to agree with you. You're right. Because when the item master is not managed correctly, you can get into outdated products being in there that are pushed to the preference card. You can get wrong pricing. They did it by the case rather than by the each. That pushes out to the patient's bill. Those are just some things that you start finding in this space. When I negotiate a new contract, what do I have to do to get it into the item master? How are those items pushed over to the electronic medical record so the nurse or the scrub tech can build the preference card? So there's a lot of pieces that it can't be a siloed project. And you can't have people in this space that sometimes don't understand the clinical aspects or the clinical supply and how it's used. I have an example of that. I had someone that's non-clinical, and this isn't let's pick on non-clinical day people, but I had a person that came in and I needed a specific type of drain for the doctor. He wanted a Penrose drain. They end up getting what's called a T-tube drain. Had nothing to do with Penrose drains, but they thought they were doing us a service by finding something that was of like. They're both catheters, but they serve two different functions. And so I had to go back and have that conversation with him. But that's how you can mess up a preference card. The other way you can mess up a preference card is the contracts. If you don't have the contracts in place and you're pushing that information out to the electronic medical record, you only put 5 sizes on there when you should have 8 sizes because the circulating nurse is looking for an 8 French, not a 12 French. That causes problems because we're at the detail level, which is where the rubber meets the road.
I've got to ask you a question. This is something in my consulting work that I've come across several times. It has to do with the charge master. 2 quick things. The first one is I've had one system that had 18 steps that you had to go through in order to get a product into their charge master between the approvals and everything else. And it would take quite a while. And, which was kind of crazy. The other thing has to do with, you were talking about getting the items into the item file. Let's take, for example, a trauma tray with multiple screws and plates of different sizes, of different materials, etc. Do you put all those things into the item file, or do you have a charge for plates and screws?
Sure. Great question. That can be handled in 2 different ways. One is I was fortunate enough to have a nurse that loved that kind of detail. So when I had a tray that had plates and screws, they were willing to sit down and champion it and put it into the OR EMR, which allowed us then to also then let the nurse in the operating room specifically select what's going on. You got to remember that the medical record is a legal document. And if you don't have that set up correctly, you can get into trouble pretty quick if you're putting the wrong size or the wrong item in and billing the patient, and it comes back and the doctor, it doesn't match up with what the doctor put in his op report. So there are problems there. But I think, Paul, back to your question about how do you get items into the system, 16 steps. Here's what I had to do at the trauma center. What we actually did is we started in as simple as a spreadsheet. After the contract was put together, I actually took the contract from the vendor and I identified all the information that is needed in accounting because it needs to be set up there. Once that was done, it was pushed over to what we called our materials management people in the operating room that are basically scrub techs that have been at the operating room for 15 years in different specialties. And they focus on what is the size, what is the description of the product and those kind of things. Then it came to me. I validated everything that they had and what was on. I validated against the contract. Once that's done, it's another simple step. I push it over to the people at the item master. And I'll say, hey guys, I need to have this information loaded into the item master. And they know what they need to do over there. They assign the numbers. They put in the HCPCS codes. They put in descriptions. They put in how we're going to bill it out. And then here's the good piece. He pushes it over to the charge master people and the people in patient financial services. They in turn then take that information and marry it with their stuff that they have to use to post charges to a patient's bill. Ultimately, it comes back to us. Then I give it to the person. They know that it's complete. It's like a checklist in a circle. And we can do this as fast as 24 hours, or I can take 2 or 3 days, depending upon the need for the product. So that's one way of handling it. And that worked fairly well for us.
One issue that I ran into a lot at my last facility was actually the consistency of the naming convention of items entered into the item master. If you're trying to charge for normal saline irrigation got entered with NaCl 0.9% something. But then my 1 liter normal saline that was poured on the back table I had to look up 1 liter and then I would find it spelled out sodium chloride. And it was not consistent. And it was the most frustrating thing. And maybe my question is, how do you demand a naming convention that's consistent? Because then that make sure that your charting is correct because people can actually find what they're looking for in the charting when they want to document it.
Well, one of the ways we did it is we had a noun as the leading convention: screw, plate, catheter, stent, valve, stem. I don't know. Those are things that come to mind really quick. Then after that, we put in the description. But then also it gives you an opportunity in the electronic medical record in the operating room to put in acronyms that the nurse goes by. Example, a Kittner could be called a peanut. So there's different things that come together that make that work for them. If they don't understand Kittner, they can't look it up. They can certainly look up peanut and boom, there it is. And then they can make sure they can either change the quantity or add it to the list if they want to bill for the services or the products used.
All right, Paul. Well, you did a phenomenal job in this interview, especially I just like how broad the perspective was of tying everything together. But then, to this conversation with Melanie at the very end here, making sure that the details are there for everybody to kind of relate to it. But the big picture part of this conversation is so critical. Nobody ever really talks about revenue cycle, it seems. And I love that you pulled that in here because based on the way things have gone over the last 2 years, revenue is a conversation you don't always, you hear savings a lot. You hear efficiency. You hear quick turnover times, but you don't really hear revenue cycle the way you probably should. And, a lot of times think about expired products and what that does to the revenue cycle, what it does to waste in the industry. And when there's high demand and you're already overpaying for those products, and other people need them and then they're expiring, that's a huge hit, not only to the revenue cycle for the organization, but it really hits the supply chain globally. That waste is killing us. So I'm really glad you brought that up.
Yeah, that is a unique space. I have to think, Justin, that probably 95% of the nurses or the people that live in the business world are not totally familiar with. It's an uncomfortable space to move into, but it's extremely critical in understanding the total global business of the operating room. I can't stress it enough. I'll have to say that we did collect $3.2 million in underpayments based upon contractual agreements over a certain time period. And as a result of that, the hospital was able to collect that money. but it only dealt with the fact that we made sure that we had good information in our payer contracts and how it was paid. And we would have them audited. We would audit just about every one that goes out the door. This was for one of the largest healthcare systems in the state of Georgia.
Yeah, but it pays for itself. Pays for itself.
Oh, yeah, 10 times over. So it really is. And not only that, it tightens it up. It reduces the revenue cycle. One day I was called into the patient financial services director. She's over like 8 hospitals. And I thought, this ain't going to be good. I get in there and she says, hey, I have to tell you, based on your audits and what you have done, you cut our revenue cycle from 83 days down to 68 days, which is phenomenal.
Yeah, people don't talk about cash flow either. They don't talk about cash flow.
No. So you talk about that space, it's just unique unto itself. But unless, again, I tie back into the operating room, if you can't pull that information together correctly and what I call anatomically to get it onto the right documents, to get it onto the right billing forms, the documentation to support it, the authorizations, it can crash on you. So as a result of that, you're able to really look at it in a different light. So it works really well when you get all the pieces oiled.
Well, great job, Paul. I really appreciate you coming on the show today and sharing that insight. Really important things for people to be thinking about. Business conscience, really in the last 10 years, has gone up substantially amongst clinicians, and it's only going to keep rising. It's going to be an expectation in the future. So
it is. It is setting the expectation. And I do have people that I've worked with everywhere from some of the major healthcare systems in the country. And I'm finding out that even in some of their educational courses, they don't blend into some of these spaces. They clip the top off, but they never get down deep into the weeds. And that's where you've got to understand it to maximize all kinds of efficiencies as well as reimbursements.
that was Paul Rhodes, perioperative consultant of clinical and business operations at auditmed.net. And Paul, we talked a lot about really end-to-end financial conversations, but at the center of it all is the OR business manager, maybe hidden, not front and center in front of the patient, but definitely an extremely important role. And some of the numbers he threw out in terms of revenue capture that could have been lost revenue, and just that attention to detail and the education required to make sure that clinicians are on board and understand this, and the demand that that's going to be of all of us going forward into the future, I think is extremely relevant. If you look at what's happened over the last 2 years, the business side of healthcare has never been more front and center for clinicians.
He really has a excellent grasp of how all of these different data points are interconnected and how it translates into the clinical practice in the operating rooms. And I think that that is what's so important, and so many people fail to understand. Even just little things like the terminology used on the item file or setting up of the preference list, making sure you have the right preference card, can totally throw off an entire schedule in the operating room for a day. So it's really good information that I think that even at the staff level, it's important for them to understand the role of what a business manager does.
All right. Well, that's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support First Case by subscribing on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts. You can also find us on Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or search for First Case on your favorite podcast application. You know what, though? We've got our own smartphone application, and if you download it, you can access bonus content. And while you're there downloading, we'd really appreciate a rating and a review, because your feedback is important to the show. And on behalf of Melanie, Paul, and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of First Case.